The chamber of the Interstellar Senate had never been this silent. Thousands of voices from hundreds of worlds could fill the air with endless debates, but on this day, every delegate sat frozen, their eyes locked on the projection in the center. Suspended in shimmering light, the image of a warship slowly rotated, its black hull swallowing the stars around it. It wasn't sleek like the cruisers of the Zarin fleets or adorned with the crystalline symmetry of the Velari. It looked sharp, angular, and unapologetically practical. And that was what terrified them most, because this ship did not belong to any of them. It belonged to humanity. For years, the galaxy had dismissed Earth as backward, a species too new, to the stars to matter. Humans had been tolerated, sometimes mocked, occasionally studied for their stubborn adaptability. Their fleets were small, their colonies scattered, their technology, by Senate standards, decades behind. But all those assumptions shattered the moment this warship appeared on the Senate's main display. Whispers broke through the silence, but no one dared raise their voice. It was not just the size of the vessel that commanded attention. It was the audacity of its design. Every plate of its armor spoke of survival. Every weapon port hinted at purpose. It was not meant to parade through Senate space like the ornamental vessels of older civilizations. It was meant to fight. And more than that, it was meant to win. The center of the chamber, the human ambassador stood alone. His posture was steady, but those who watched closely could see the tension in his shoulders. His people had asked him to do something dangerous, something unprecedented. For decades, humanity had played the role of the underdog in galactic politics, hiding their capabilities behind a mask of humility. But that mask had been removed today, and the galaxy was seeing what humans had built in the shadows. He glanced at the projection, then back at the sea of alien eyes fixed on him. Not one of them believed humanity could have built such a thing, not without help. Yet there it was, undeniable, real, and very much alive in the void. The ship had a name, though the ambassador had not yet spoken it. To humans, names carried weight. This one had been chosen with care, whispered in secret, built in silence, and sworn to with loyalty. Every engineer, every worker, every pilot who had touched the hidden project knew they were making something more than metal and firepower. They were crafting a message, one that would echo across the stars. Humanity was not defenseless, and they would not bow. But now, as the ambassador stood before the Senate, the true risk unfolded. Not the unveiling of the ship itself, but the reaction it would provoke. Some senators leaned forward, curiosity burning in their eyes. Others recoiled, their tendrils, feathers or scaled limbs shifting uneasily as if the ship's very image threatened them. The more powerful empires narrowed their gaze, trying to calculate whether this vessel upset the balance they had maintained for centuries. Humanity had been tolerated as long as they remained weak. Weakness was safe. Weakness could be managed. But strength was dangerous. The ambassador began to speak, his words calm but firm. He reminded the chamber that humanity had never sought conquest, that Earth had joined the Senate peacefully, abiding by its laws and respecting its order. He spoke of trade, of cooperation, of the small but growing bonds between species. Yet every word carried the weight of what hung above them. The ship was proof that humanity had been underestimated. It was also a warning. Humanity had built this warship not for aggression, but because they had learned a harsh truth in their short time among the stars. Trust did not guarantee safety. Too many times had humanity seen smaller civilizations crushed or erased when they could not defend themselves. Too many times had Senate words failed to stop fleets from burning worlds. Humanity had watched, and humanity had remembered. As his voice echoed through the chamber, the projection shifted. The image zoomed in on the warship's hull, showing weapons arrays unlike anything the Senate fleets employed. There were missile, Bays with trajectories unpredictable by standard defense grids, kinetic cannons designed to pierce shields, and systems the aliens could not identify at all. This was no simple upgrade of existing designs. It was something entirely different, something born of humanity's unique perspective on survival. And yet the ambassador had revealed only what they were willing to show. No one in that chamber knew if what they saw was the full truth or merely a shadow of the ship's actual power. Unease spread like a ripple. Delegates whispered to their aides, calculating strategies. Was this a challenge? A declaration of independence from Senate oversight? Or worse, was humanity preparing for a war none of them had seen coming? Every civilization had secrets, but few dared reveal them in this chamber. For humanity to step forward with this warship now meant one of two things. Either they sought protection by showing their teeth, or they intended to alter the balance of the galaxy entirely. The ambassador let the silence hang after his words. In that pause, hearts across the chamber pounded. Somewhere deep inside, many of them remembered their first encounters with humans, their fierce resolve, their ability to endure where others would falter, their strange, unpredictable creativity. Those traits had seemed harmless when confined to small colonies and modest ships, but now, forged into steel and shadow, they had become something else, something the galaxy had not expected, something the galaxy feared. And then came the moment no one had anticipated. A signal cut through the Senate's communication grid, unbidden and uninvited. The hologram of the warship flickered, then steadied again, but now it was no mere projection. Live feed. The ship itself had entered orbit above the Senate's homeworld. Gasps and shouts filled the chamber as the reality struck. It was not an image meant to impress. It was here. It was real. It was waiting above them. The ambassador did not move. His expression remained calm, though the tension in his eyes betrayed the risk his people had taken. The Senate was no longer staring at a concept. They were staring at a choice. They could demand humanity stand down, attempt to strip them of their creation, or accept the truth, that the galaxy was no longer theirs alone to control. Above the ID world, the hidden warship hung silent, a shadow in the stars. Its weapons remained cold, but its presence was louder than any threat. Delegates across the chamber looked at one another, wondering who would speak first. Who would demand answers? Who would dare call humanity's bluff? If it was a bluff at all. The balance of the galaxy teetered in that silence. And humanity's next move would decide whether it fell into fear, into war, or into something no one could yet imagine. And as the chamber erupted into chaos, the human ambassador finally raised his hand to speak again, the weight of the moment pressing down, like a storm. What he was about to say would decide humanity's place among the stars forever. The uproar in the Senate chamber was instant and deafening. Voices clashed in dozens of alien tongues, their translators struggling to keep up. Some demanded that the warship be seized, that humanity be stripped of its Senate membership. Others argued that the ship was a bluff, a trick of projections, an exaggeration meant to sway politics. Yet behind the noise, every delegate knew the truth. No illusion could have made the Senate's defense grid trigger. No projection could have forced planetary shields to realign in orbit. The ship was real. It was there. And it was human. The ambassador stood at the center unmoving, letting the chaos wash around him. He had expected this. He knew the revelation would split the chamber, but he also knew fear was sometimes stronger than dismissal. For too long, humanity's voice had been ignored in this hall. Now, every voice shouted his people's name, every eye fixed on Earth. For the first time, the galaxy realized that humanity mattered. Yet power came with risk, and even as he stood tall, he wondered how long until the storm outside these walls became more than words. To understand how this moment came to be, one had to look back, far beyond the polished surface of the Senate floor. Humanity's rise into space had been messy, desperate, and filled with mistakes. They had not been guided by ancient dynasties like the Zaith, nor by millennia of empire building like the Kraith Dominion. Humans had clawed their way upward in less than 2 centuries, burning through the chaos of their own wars until necessity forced unity. And in that unity, something had grown, something that alarmed the galaxy without them realizing it. Humans learned faster than expected. They adapted with frightening ease. What took other species generations to refine, humanity managed in decades. That ability made them dangerous. Still, in the grand halls of the Senate, humans were rarely taken seriously. Their fleets were modest, their technology serviceable but unremarkable. Their colonies were scattered along the fringe, vulnerable to pirates or ambitious neighbors. The larger empires saw them as useful workers, expendable explorers, even as entertaining curiosities. But Earth had seen what the Senate pretended not to see. Humanity had watched smaller civilizations vanish when their petitions for help were denied. Humanity had seen trade routes burned, colonies erased, treaties ignored. They had listened to promises of peace from this very chamber, only to see fleets launch under the banner of containment or stability. It was then that a secret project began. Not a Senate-approved defense pact, not an official initiative, but something born in the silence of hidden shipyards buried in asteroids and dead moons. They called it only by a code at first, nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would betray its intent. The work was dangerous, illegal even if discovered. Senate law was clear. No member species was allowed to construct warships beyond approved tonnage or weapon classifications. Humanity broke that law in silence. They poured resources into the hidden program, disguising shipments as trade goods, reassigning engineers under false identities, burying trails in layers of bureaucracy. Even some within humanity's own leadership did not know the full scope. For those who worked on the ship, secrecy was a way of life. Entire generations of us workers were raised in isolation, knowing only that they were part of something that had to remain hidden. They built not with the luxury of abundance, but with desperation, scavenging designs from dozens of worlds, integrating human creativity into systems stolen, borrowed, or reinvented. Every failure cost them years. Every success pushed them closer to something unthinkable. A vessel that could stand against the warships of empires far older than humanity itself. The decision to reveal it had not been made lightly. For decades, the warship had remained in the shadows, a weapon too dangerous to expose, a card held close to the chest. But whispers of invasion had grown louder. Humanity's colonies had been threatened more openly. Pirates began using weapons that should not have been in their hands, Senate-made, yet conveniently lost in transit. And then came the reports, small at first but unmistakable. Certain empires were preparing joint operations in human territory, operations that had not been approved by the Senate. Earth's leaders realized the truth. The moment was coming when humanity would stand alone. If they kept hiding, they would be crushed. If they revealed the ship, they might just change the game. And so here it was. No longer buried in shadows, but floating above the Senate's homeworld. A warship built in secret, larger than anything humanity had ever shown, bristling with weapons that no one could predict. Its sudden appearance forced the Senate to face questions they had ignored for too long. Was humanity a threat? Or was humanity the warning sign of something deeper, a flaw in the order they had built? The ambassador knew what many in the chamber were thinking. Some feared the ship itself, but others feared what it represented. If humanity could build this in silence, who else might be hiding something? How many harmless civilizations were quietly arming themselves, waiting for the moment to reveal their teeth? The galaxy's balance had been kept by fear of the great empires. But now that balance trembled, and the first crack had appeared in the form of a human warship. The ambassador's eyes swept the chamber, landing on certain delegates. The Zaith, their golden carapaces gleaming, whispered among themselves, their antennae twitching in agitation. They had always believed themselves untouchable, their fleets unmatched. Now they wondered if they had been wrong. The Velari, with their crystalline bodies, remained motionless, their silence far more dangerous than any shouted word. And in the far corner, the Kraith Dominion's envoy leaned back, arms crossed, studying the ambassador with predatory calm. They were already calculating how this shift could be turned to their advantage. But beyond the political maneuvering, beyond the whispers of fear, there was something else: curiosity. Many in the chamber had never truly considered humanity as more than background noise in the galaxy. Yet here they were, demanding attention not with words, but with action. Some could not help but wonder, what kind of people would dare build such a thing in the shadows of giants? What kind of people would risk everything to stand here today? The ambassador's next words were drowned out by the rising voices, but it didn't matter. The image of the ship above them said more than words could. And even as he stood steady, he felt the weight of what was still hidden. For even now, not all of humanity's secrets had been revealed. The ship was powerful, yes, but it was not the only project humanity had undertaken in the silence of forgotten corners of space. There were other stations, other experiments, other plans that even the Senate's finest intelligence agencies had not glimpsed. The galaxy had only seen the surface. Above the Senate's world, the warship remained still, its dark hull catching the faint light of the system's star. No weapons were primed, no engines burned, yet its silence spoke louder than any barrage of firepower. Delegates tried to convince themselves it was a show of restraint, a gesture of peace. But many could not silence the darker thought that the ship didn't need to fire to be dangerous. Its very existence was the weapon. And so the chamber remained divided, fear clashing with curiosity, outrage clashing with silence. The ambassador waited for the storm to crest, for someone to demand action. He knew it would come. Already messages raced through private channels, summoning fleets, rallying allies, preparing for what might follow. Whether humanity wanted it or not, the galaxy would never see them the same again. The question hung heavy in the air, unspoken yet present in every mind. Had humanity just secured their survival? Or had they just declared a war no one was ready to fight? And as the chamber's uproar reached its peak, a sudden alert flashed across the consoles of every delegate. A transmission, intercepted but not fully decoded. Its origin was unclear, its signal fractured, but its meaning was unmistakable. Somewhere beyond Senate space, someone had already moved. Someone had not been surprised by the appearance of the human warship. Someone had been expecting it. The ambassador's heart tightened as he saw the fragments of the intercepted message scroll across the air. Whatever humanity thought they had revealed on their own terms, it seemed the galaxy was already playing, a game deeper than they had imagined. The hidden warship was no longer just a weapon. It was the first move in a struggle humanity could not yet see the end of. The chamber froze once more, the noise dying into an uneasy quiet. And in that silence, the warship above remained, its shadow stretching across the Senate's world, a promise or a warning that nothing would ever be the same again. The intercepted transmission had spread through the Senate chamber like a spark on dry grass. Delegates who had been shouting moments earlier now sat in silence, their eyes locked on the fragmented words that hovered in the air. No one could deny what the fragments implied. Someone outside this chamber, perhaps outside the Senate itself, had known of humanity's hidden warship long before its reveal. That knowledge unsettled everyone because it meant the balance of secrecy had already been broken. If the information had slipped into the wrong hands, then the galaxy was not simply dealing with the surprise of a single human warship, it was facing the possibility of a much larger storm already in motion. The ambassador stood still, but inside his mind was racing. He had expected anger, suspicion, even threats from the Senate. But this shadowy confirmation that another force was already aware, was worse. Humanity had revealed its strength as a warning, as a way to claim respect, but now it might be seen as part of something more sinister. Whispers rippled through the chamber, some accusing humanity of collusion with powers outside the Senate, others suggesting humanity was only the pawn of a greater threat. The ambassador knew if that idea took root, humanity would be destroyed, not for what it had done, but for what others believed it represented. Across the chamber, the Velari delegation finally spoke. Their voices were like the grinding of crystal, soft yet piercing. They asked the question that had been lurking in every mind. If humanity could hide this warship for decades, what else might they be hiding? And if someone else already knew, could it mean there were others waiting in the dark? Allies or enemies ready to move when the Senate was weakest? The silence that followed made it clear the question struck deep. Humanity had lifted a veil, but in doing so they had revealed more than their own secret. They had revealed how fragile the Senate's trust truly was. Above the planet, the warship remained still, casting its shadow like an omen. But inside that warship, far from the noise of the chamber, the crew lived the weight of the gamble. They were not seasoned veterans of endless campaigns like the fleets of older empires. Many were young, untested, carrying the pride and fear of representing all humanity in this single vessel. Engineers monitored every system with quiet intensity, knowing one misstep could spark a war. Pilots sat at their stations, hands hovering over controls they prayed they would never have to use. And deep within the ship, officers debated whether they were protectors or bait. Had humanity built this ship to keep their people safe, or had they built it knowing they would be forced to fight? Back in the Senate, the debate fractured further. The Kraith Dominion envoy leaned forward, his tone calm but filled with menace. He suggested a joint inspection of the human warship under Senate supervision to ensure it posed no threat. It was a trap, clear to everyone. To allow such an inspection would mean stripping humanity of the mystery, giving away the very leverage that had forced the galaxy to listen. Yet to refuse would appear as guilt, proof that humanity was hiding more than they admitted. The ambassador could see the trap closing, but he also knew Earth would never allow strangers aboard their creation. That ship was more than steel and weapons. It was a symbol, and no empire would be allowed to dismantle it piece by piece under the guise of safety. Meanwhile, on Earth and its colonies, the news was spreading faster than officials could contain it. The moment the warship appeared in Senate space, its image raced through civilian networks, carried on merchant ships, whispered in every corner of human settlement. For the first time, humanity's scattered worlds felt a surge of pride. They were no longer the weak newcomers mocked by neighbors. They had something that could stand against fleets. But pride came with fear. Parents whispered of retaliation, of fleets gathering to crush them before they could build more. Traders wondered if their routes would become targets. Soldiers spoke of war as if it were already at their door. That warship had united humanity's image, but it had also painted a target on every human world. Among the Senate's oldest members, another conflict brewed quietly. Some of the great empires had long been waiting for an excuse to rein in the Senate itself. They had grown weary of the endless debates, the endless rules that slowed their ambitions. Humanity's revelation and the chaos it created gave them an opportunity. If they could frame Earth as a destabilizing force, they could use the crisis to seize more control. Already, private messages flew between delegates, agreements forming in shadows. Humanity had thought the ship would place them at the center of the chamber, but in truth, they had become the perfect excuse for rival powers to test one another. And then there was the mystery of the intercepted message. Fragments continued to filter in, decoded piece by Senate intelligence. What emerged was troubling. It spoke of assets in position, of timelines accelerated, of the veil broken. None of it directly named humanity, yet the timing was impossible to ignore. Someone had been waiting for this day. Someone had known the ship would eventually appear, and they had plans already in motion. The question that haunted every delegate and every officer aboard the warship was simple. Who? Was it one of the empires pretending ignorance while preparing their own strike? Was it a power outside Senate space, long hidden, now watching with interest? Or was it something worse, something the galaxy had yet to face? For the ambassador, the conflict was no longer just survival. It was trust. How could he convince the chamber that humanity's intentions were not conquest, not rebellion, but survival? Every word he spoke risked twisting into evidence against him. Every pause was a chance for rivals to fill the silence with their own suspicions. Yet he also knew silence could not last. Humanity had shown the galaxy their hidden hand, but in doing so, they had forced every other power to question its own secrets. No one trusted humanity, but worse, no one trusted anyone else either. On the warship itself, the captain, one of the few who knew the full history of the project, walked the silent corridors and listened to his crew's hushed conversations. He knew morale balanced on a knife's edge. Pride burned in their hearts, but so did fear. He wondered if the Senate chamber below understood that this ship, for all its power, was still untested in true war. Its weapons had been fired in simulations, its engines pushed in controlled trials, but never had it stood against the wrath of a real fleet. And yet here they were, orbiting the Senate's capital world, surrounded by defenses that could, in theory, obliterate them if the order was given. One mistake, one miscalculation, and they would not just lose a ship, they would lose the fragile place humanity had carved in the stars. The galaxy hung in suspense. Every species, every empire, every colony was waiting to see what happened next. Would the Senate order humanity to stand down? Would fleets begin to move on Earth's borders? Or would the shadow hinted at in the intercepted message reveal itself first? No one knew, and that uncertainty was more dangerous than any weapon. The ambassador raised his voice once more, speaking over the chamber's noise. He reminded them that humanity had not come to wage war, but to survive in a galaxy that often chose the strong over the weak. He urged them to see the warship not as a threat, but as proof that humanity had the will to endure. But even as he spoke, he could feel the walls closing. Some in the chamber listened, others plotted, and still others watched with cold silence. Above them, the hidden warship remained motionless, but in the dark of space, unseen eyes were already watching. Somewhere far beyond Senate space, signals pulsed through the void, carrying orders and warnings. Humanity had thought this reveal was their choice, but the game was larger than they realized. The warship was not just humanity's secret anymore. It was the spark that had lit fires in places they could not yet see. And as the chamber waited for its next move, the galaxy itself seemed to hold its breath, knowing the storm was only beginning. The silence in the Senate chamber did not last long. It fractured, broke apart into a storm of accusations, demands, and threats hurled across the Great Hall. The warship above the planet loomed like a blade, held at the throat of every delegate, and its shadow seemed to weigh heavier with each passing second. The intercepted transmission had poisoned the air. No one knew who had sent it. No one knew who had received it, but everyone understood what it meant. Humanity's secret was not theirs alone. Someone else had been watching, waiting, and perhaps planning to use this moment to ignite something far larger than anyone could control. The ambassador tried to keep his voice steady as he addressed the chamber again, but every word felt like throwing pebbles into a hurricane. He spoke of survival, of humanity's desperate struggle to defend its colonies, of the simple truth that weakness in this galaxy was a death sentence. He insisted that the warship was not an act of defiance, but of necessity. But the delegates were no longer listening with open minds. Their ears were tuned to suspicion, their eyes fixed on the ship above them, and their thoughts on how quickly the balance of power might shift if humanity were allowed to keep what they had revealed. Behind the polished calm of official speeches, secret communications flared across private channels. Fleets began to move. The Zaith, rattled by their own fear of losing dominance, issued immediate orders for battle groups to shift toward human borders. The Kraith Dominion, always seeking advantage, offered protection to certain neutral species in exchange for military support. The Velari remained silent, but their crystalline war councils gathered in quiet urgency. The galaxy had not yet declared war, but its teeth were already bared. On Earth and its colonies, unease turned to panic. Images of the warship orbiting. The Senate Capitol filled every broadcast, stirring both pride and dread. Some saw it as proof that humanity had finally earned respect among the stars. Others saw it as a death sentence, believing the empires would never allow humanity to stand so tall without striking them down. Ships in the outer colonies prepared evacuation drills. Soldiers were placed on high alert. Merchants tried to hoard supplies, fearing blockades. The hidden warship, once a secret dream of strength, now carried the weight of expectation from an entire species. If it failed, humanity would fall with it. On the warship itself, tension coiled tighter with every heartbeat. The crew lived in constant readiness, unsure if the next signal from the planet would be an order to fire or a demand to retreat. The captain walked the bridge in silence, watching his officers' faces, seeing the pride warring with fear in their eyes. They all knew the truth. No matter how powerful their ship was, they were outnumbered 1,000 to 1 if the Senate turned against them. The warship could fight, it could strike fear, but could it survive the full fury of galactic fleets? That question hung over every console, every flashing light, every whispered prayer. The intercepted transmission continued to haunt the Senate. More fragments were decoded, and with each piece, the picture grew darker. The words spoke of unveiling, of the human shadow, of ignition. It was clear now. Whoever had sent the message had been waiting for humanity to step into the light. Their reveal had triggered something, but no one knew what. The Senate's intelligence corps scrambled to trace the source, but the signals slipped through space like smoke, leaving no trail. The uncertainty was worse than an open threat. Every empire wondered if the shadow behind the message was an ally of humanity or an enemy planning to use them as a spark. The chamber grew more divided. Some demanded immediate action, detain the ambassador, seize the warship, strip humanity of Senate protection. Others argued that such a move would push humanity into open defiance, perhaps even into the arms of the unknown force hinted at in the transmissions. The ambassador stood in the center of this storm, his voice low but steady, reminding them again that humanity had come not for conquest, but for survival. But even as he spoke, he saw the truth written in their faces. They did not believe him. Some could not, and others did not want to. Far from the Senate's world, on the dark edges of explored space, movement stirred. Fleets that had no banner, no allegiance to the Senate, began to shift. Stations long thought abandoned lit up with activity. Signals moved in coded bursts, whispering of an opportunity that had finally arrived. For too long, these hidden forces had waited in the dark, watching the great powers squabble. Now, with humanity's reveal shaking the foundation of the Senate, the time to strike drew near. They would let the galaxy tear itself apart in fear and suspicion, and then they would move. Back in the chamber, the Kraith envoy rose again, his words like poisoned honey. He called for a vote, not for peace, not for patience, but for immediate action. He suggested the warship be boarded by a coalition force, its weapons dismantled, its technology studied. He insisted this was the only way to restore balance and prevent chaos. The ambassador's heart sank as murmurs of agreement spread through the chamber. To allow them aboard would be to lose everything. To refuse would be to confirm every suspicion. The trap was closing tighter. On the warship, sensors lit up. Ships were moving into orbit, not hostile yet, but close enough to make every crew member stiffen in their seats. Defense grids shifted, shields flickered, and targeting arrays whispered of possibilities. The captain's voice was calm as he gave orders, but the tension in the bridge was thick. Every officer knew that one wrong signal, one nervous hand on the trigger, could turn the standoff into a massacre. The ambassador raised his hand, trying to stop the chamber's descent into madness. His words carried the weight of desperation. Now, he warned them that tearing apart humanity's warship would not end their fears. It would only confirm them. He reminded them that the intercepted transmission proved humanity was not the only secret in the galaxy. He pleaded that they focus not on destroying each other, but on finding the hidden force already moving in the dark. His voice rang through the chamber, but his eyes told him the truth. Reason was slipping away. Whispers grew into arguments. Arguments grew into shouts. Shouts turned into threats. The chamber that once claimed to govern peace was now on the edge of tearing itself apart. And above them, the warship waited, its shadow stretching longer, its silence louder than any weapon. In that silence, the intercepted transmission flared again. This time it was not fragments. This time it was whole. Across the Senate chamber, and into the warship's systems, the message echoed clear for all to hear. The fire begins where the shadow falls. The human spark has lit the path. The fleets are moving. Prepare. The words fell like thunder. Delegates froze. Officers on the warship stiffened. The ambassador felt the weight of 1,000 stares pressing on him. Whoever had sent that message had just declared that the galaxy's storm was already underway. Humanity was not the cause, but it was the trigger. On the edges of space, fleets without banners surged forward. On the bridge of the warship, weapons flickered online in silent readiness. And in the Senate chamber, the last threads of order began to unravel as the galaxy braced for what was coming. The warship's shadow deepened across the capital world. The tension in the chamber reached its breaking point. The galaxy had not yet fallen into war, but everyone could feel it coming. It was no longer a question of if. It was a question of when. And in that moment, with voices clashing, fleets moving, and the mysterious signal echoing through every mind, the ambassador realized humanity had been pulled into a storm far greater than they had imagined. The climax was coming, and there would be no way to escape it. The last words of the transmission still echoed in the chamber when a ripple of panic broke through the delegates. Translators buzzed frantically, aides scrambled with data pads, and private channels blazed with desperate signals. "The fleets are moving!" It was more than a threat. It was confirmation. Somewhere beyond the Senate's reach, war had already begun. Yet the most chilling part was the phrase that came before it. The fire begins where the shadow falls. All eyes turned upward, toward the silent shape of the human warship orbiting the capital. The implication was impossible to ignore. Whoever had sent the message had tied their plans to humanity, deliberately or not. The ambassador felt the weight of that moment like iron on his chest. His people had unveiled their hidden strength to prove they were not prey, but in doing so, they had become the symbol of something larger, something they did not control. He could see it in the faces around him, the conviction that humanity was no longer just a small player in galactic politics. They were now the fulcrum on which the galaxy could tilt toward war. Whether that was true didn't matter. Belief was enough, and belief spread faster than truth. On the warship itself, alarms began to whisper across the bridge. Long-range sensors, tuned to pick up faint distortions in space, were detecting movement. Not in nearby orbits, not in the Senate's fleets, but farther out, beyond the capital system. Something was coming. The captain studied the displays, his hands tightening around the edge of the console. The signatures were faint, but they did not belong to Senate fleets. They were irregular, mismatched, like a patchwork force pieced together, from dozens of origins. That made them even more dangerous. A hidden fleet that did not belong to any one empire meant only one thing. Alliances had formed in the dark, and no one in the Senate had known. Back in the chamber, the Kraith envoy's voice cut through the chaos. He accused humanity outright of collusion, insisting that the mysterious fleets were proof that Earth had been conspiring with forces outside the Senate. The accusation spread like fire, feeding the fears of those who already doubted the ambassador's words. The ambassador tried to speak, to argue, to plead for reason, but the noise drowned him out. It didn't matter what he said anymore. Humanity was no longer simply on trial for building a warship. They were being blamed for the galaxy's unraveling. But then something unexpected happened. A delegate from one of the smaller species, a people long ignored in Senate debates, stood and spoke with trembling courage. They revealed that their worlds had been raided months before, not by pirates, but by organized fleets flying no flag. They had pleaded for help, but the Senate had dismissed them. Now, they said, those same fleets had returned in greater numbers, and they suspected those fleets were the ones now moving toward the capital. The chamber fell into uneasy silence at the words. It was no longer a distant rumor. The threat was real, and it had already left scars. The warship's sensors confirmed it minutes later. A fleet was approaching, larger than anything the hidden human ship had ever faced in simulations. The Senate's own defenses scrambled to adjust, their commanders caught unprepared. The irony was bitter. While the chamber argued over humanity's secret, the real enemy had already crossed into their skies. The ambassador felt his throat tighten as he realized the second twist of fate. Humanity's reveal had not caused the storm. It had drawn the lightning to the Senate's very heart. Still, suspicion did not fade. Some delegates whispered that humanity had lured the fleets here on purpose, to weaken the Senate and rise from its ashes. Others believed humanity had been a pawn, their warship nothing more than bait in a trap laid by unknown powers. In either case, the conclusion was the same. The galaxy's balance was broken, and humanity was at the center of it. On the warship, the captain faced an impossible choice. His crew watched him with wide eyes, waiting for his command. Do they remain passive, proving that humanity sought no aggression? Or do they prepare to fight, knowing that the enemy fleet was coming whether the Senate trusted them or not? To do nothing risked annihilation. To act risked confirming every fear the Senate already held. The captain's silence stretched across the bridge, every second louder than the last. The ambassador received a message through his earpiece, his heart thundering as he listened. The captain had sent him the data, unmistakable evidence of the approaching fleet. With steady breath, he raised his voice in the chamber once more, forcing it to cut through the storm of arguments. He declared that the Senate's capital was under threat, not from humanity, but from forces that had long been ignored. He offered the warships weapons, not as a threat, but as protection. It was a gamble more dangerous than silence. If the Senate accepted, humanity would prove their worth. If the Senate refused, the warship might be forced to act alone, and that would seal their fate. For a moment, the chamber froze. Delegates exchanged glances, torn between fear of the warship above them and fear of the fleet closing in from the dark. No one wanted to admit it, but they all knew the truth. The Senate's fleets, though powerful, were scattered across the galaxy. The only vessel in position to stand against the incoming attack was the very ship they feared most, the human warship. Whispers became arguments again, but beneath them all ran a current of dread. The intercepted transmission had promised the fire would begin where the shadow fell. And now, as the enemy fleet surged closer, that prophecy was becoming real. Humanity's shadow had indeed fallen across the Senate's world, and the fire was about to begin. The ambassador stood firm, but inside, unease gnawed at him. He could not shake the feeling that all of this, the hidden fleets, the intercepted transmissions, even humanity's reveal, was part of something larger. Someone had maneuvered them into this exact position. Someone had known the galaxies. Fear of humanity would blind them long enough for the real threat to strike. And as he watched the chamber dissolve into chaos, he realized the terrifying possibility that humanity was not just a spark, but the intended scapegoat. On the warship, the crew watched the enemy signatures multiply across their displays. Dozens, then hundreds of ships emerging from the void with frightening coordination. Their hulls bore no banners, but their weapons glowed with deadly intent. The captain gave his orders quietly, preparing defenses, charging weapons, though still holding fire. Around them, the Senate's own defense fleet scrambled to launch, but they were uncoordinated, caught in the middle of their leader's indecision. As the first wave of enemy ships pierced the outer defenses, the warship's sensors flared red. Missiles streaked across space, energy lances tore through shields, and the skies above the Senate's world lit with the fire of war. The chamber shook as defense grids came online, alarms blaring through the Capitol. Delegates screamed, some calling for immediate surrender, others for retaliation, all while the ambassador stood at the center, the weight of his people pressing on his shoulders. Above, the warship finally shifted position, engines burning as it moved to intercept the oncoming storm. Its black hull cut through the fire-lit sky, weapons armed but still silent, holding the line until the order came. And in that moment, as the galaxy's greatest powers realized the enemy was already at their doorstep, one truth became impossible to deny. Humanity's hidden warship was no longer a secret, no longer a symbol. It was the only thing standing between the Senate and destruction. But even as the enemy closed in, a darker realization flickered in the ambassador's mind. What if this fleet was not the true threat? What if this attack was only meant to draw attention, to force humanity into battle while the real plan unfolded elsewhere? The thought chilled him to the bone. The intercepted message had promised ignition, and ignition was only the first step. Whatever came after would make this battle look like the opening move in a far greater war. The chamber shuddered again as the Capitol's shields groaned under the first direct strikes. The delegates' shouts turned to cries of fear, their authority, dissolving in the face of fire. And above them, the human warship prepared to unleash its power, carrying not only the fate of humanity, but the weight of an entire galaxy caught between fear, suspicion, and an enemy no one truly understood. The stakes had never been higher, the storm had never been closer, and the moment of decision had finally arrived. Yet even then, in the heart of the chaos, the ambassador knew this was not the end. This was only the beginning, and the true climax of humanity's struggle had yet to come. The warship moved into position above the Senate's capital world, its dark hull outlined by the chaos of fire and light raging in orbit. Enemy ships poured in from the void, their weapons cutting through the planet's outer defenses like knives through paper. Explosions lit the skies, defense stations crumbled, and the chamber below trembled with every distant strike. The delegates who had spent hours shouting accusations now sat frozen in fear, their arguments drowned out by the sound of a war they could no longer ignore. On the bridge of the human warship, the captain's voice rang steady despite the storm. Orders were crisp, precise, shields to full, targeting grids online, kinetic cannons ready, missiles primed. The crew moved as one, their fear channeled into action. For years they had trained in silence, building this vessel with hope and desperation. Now their purpose was clear. The warship had been hidden to protect humanity's survival, but its first battle would decide the fate of the entire Senate. The ambassador's voice echoed through the chamber, demanding the delegates face the truth. Humanity had not brought war to their doorstep. The fleets moving against them had long been forming in the dark. If the Senate refused to see humanity as an ally, then they would die treating them as an enemy. His words carried weight now, because above them, the hidden warship was no longer just a shadow. It was the only shield the capital had left. The first clash came fast. A wave of enemy ships cut straight toward the capital, breaking through the last lines of Senate cruisers. The human warship unleashed its power at last. A storm of kinetic rounds erupted from its cannons, piercing through enemy shields with brutal force. Missiles streaked across the black, their trajectories weaving in unpredictable arcs that no countermeasure could track. Entire squadrons of hostile ships disintegrated in flashes of fire, their remains scattering like ash across the void. The crew on the bridge felt the ship shudder with each recoil, each strike, but they held steady, their voices calm under the captain's commands. For a moment, the chamber below erupted into stunned silence as the projection displayed the impossible. The human warship was holding the line. Where Senate fleets had faltered, where empires with centuries of experience had crumbled, humanity's hidden vessel cut through the enemy like it had been born for this very moment. Whispers spread among the delegates, fear giving way to awe. The accusations began to falter. The galaxy's image of humanity was shifting before their eyes, but the enemy was not finished. New waves of ships surged from the void, larger, heavier, more organized. The warship's crew fought with everything they had, but even they began to feel the strain. Shields flickered, armor groaned, alarms screamed through the corridors. The captain's hands gripped the console tighter with each strike, knowing that one more wave could break them. Humanity had built something powerful, but they were still. One ship against hundreds, and then came the twist no one had expected. In the chaos of battle, a second signal cut through every channel, overriding friend and foe alike. The voice that spoke was cold, mechanical, and unmistakably non-human. It declared that the fleets in orbit were not acting alone. They were the first spear of a larger force, a coalition that had been watching the Senate for decades. Their purpose was not simply to destroy the Senate, but to reshape the galaxy, under their control. And in that voice, the ambassador and the captain both realized something chilling. Humanity had not been the target of suspicion by accident. They had been set up. The enemy had known of the warship. They had known humanity would reveal it out of desperation, and they had counted on the Senate's fear to blind them long enough for the fleets to strike. Humanity had been used as the perfect distraction, the perfect scapegoat. The shadow had fallen, and the fire had begun, not because humanity wanted it, but because someone else had written them into the script. The ambassador's heart burned with fury as he spoke to the chamber one final time. He told them that humanity would not play the role of pawn. They would not be blamed for the galaxy's blindness. Above them, their warship was bleeding, but it was still fighting. And if the Senate wanted to survive, they had no choice but to stand with humanity now, not against them. His voice, raw and unyielding, cut through the fear, and for the first time, the chamber began to shift. The great empires, once so eager to tear humanity down, realized the truth. Without the warship, without the humans they had mocked, their capital would already be ash. The Kraith envoy, silent for too long, finally rose, his voice harsh but resolute. He called for every fleet in the system to rally behind the human warship. The Zaith followed reluctantly, their pride bent, but not broken. Even the Velari, who had spoken so little, gave their agreement. The chamber erupted again, but this time it was not with arguments. It was with orders. Fleets across the system. Shifted, regrouped, and for the first time in centuries, the Senate fought as one. Above the planet, the warship became the spearhead of a united defense. Senate cruisers formed up behind it, their weapons coordinated by human targeting systems. The hidden warship's strange, unpredictable tactics guided the fleets, weaving chaos into order. Wave after wave of enemy ships crashed against them, but now they faced more than a single vessel. They faced an entire galaxy united by necessity. The battle raged with fury, explosions lighting the void, screams of metal tearing through the dark, and still the enemy pressed forward. The warship's crew fought with everything they had, pushing their ship beyond the limits of safety. Hull. Breaches tore through lower decks, fires raged in engineering, but no one abandoned their post. They had not built this ship to hide forever. They had built it to stand in this exact moment. The captain's voice remained calm even as the bridge shook, his orders steady, his will unbreakable. Finally, with the enemy fleet beginning to break under the combined might of the warship and the Senate's united fleets, the captain gave the order no one wanted to hear. They would unleash the ship's final weapon, the one humanity had sworn would never be used except in the direst need. Deep within the vessel, massive systems powered up, energy surging through channels that glowed with blinding light. The enemy, realizing what was coming, broke formation in a desperate attempt to retreat, but it was too late. The warship unleashed its final strike, a weapon not of conquest but of survival. A cascade of energy swept through space, not simply destroying ships but unraveling them, tearing their hulls apart at the molecular level. Entire squadrons dissolved into dust and light, vanishing in the silence of the void. The surviving fleets scattered, their formations shattered, their will broken. The attack had ended not in humanity's destruction, but in the enemy's retreat. The chamber erupted with relief, but also with unease. Humanity had saved them, but they had also shown power that no one could have imagined. The Senate delegates looked at the ambassador not with mockery, not with suspicion, but with a mix of awe and fear. Humanity had been underestimated for too long, and now the galaxy could never look at them the same again. And then came the final twist. As the last fragments of the enemy fleet disappeared into the void, a new signal arrived, colder and sharper than before. The mechanical voice returned, speaking not in threat, but in certainty. This was the first test. The shadow has proven strong. The fire will spread. The chamber froze. The ambassador felt the weight of those words sink deep into his bones. This had not been the war. This had only been the beginning. The fleets they had faced were only the first wave. Somewhere beyond the stars, something greater was waiting. The warship drifted in orbit, scarred and battered, but unbroken. Its shadow still stretched across the capital world, but now it carried a different meaning. Humanity had saved the Senate. Humanity had shown its strength, but in doing so, they had drawn the attention of an enemy far greater than anyone had imagined. The galaxy had survived the night, but the true storm was still coming. And in the silence after the battle, one truth became clear. Humanity was no longer hidden. Humanity was no longer underestimated. They had become the fire in the dark, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The battlefield above the Senate's world settled into an uneasy silence. The last fragments of the enemy fleet had vanished into the void, leaving behind only burning wreckage and drifting husks of ships that had fought to defend the planet. Fires flickered across the orbiting defense platforms, their lights dimming as emergency crews scrambled to contain the damage. In the chamber below, the delegates who had once screamed accusations now sat in stunned quiet, their faces pale, their voices muted by the weight of what they had just witnessed. The human warship drifted in orbit, scarred but standing. Its hull bore blackened wounds where enemy fire had burned deep, and whole sections of the vessel glowed faintly as repairs struggled to hold. Yet despite the damage, it remained intact, a symbol of resilience and strength. To every world watching, it was undeniable now. Humanity had not only survived the impossible, they had saved the capital of the galaxy itself. The ambassador's shoulders sagged as he finally allowed himself a breath. He had spoken until his voice was raw, endured the accusations, and carried the burden of representing his people in the most dangerous trial of their history. And yet, in the end, it had not been his words that changed the galaxy's perception. It had been the warship above them, and the men and women aboard it who had fought not only for humanity, but for everyone in that chamber. But even in victory, unease lingered. The signal that had echoed at the end of the battle still haunted them all. This was the first test. The enemy had not been defeated entirely. They had only been measuring, probing, testing the Senate's strength. And in the shadow of that warning, the delegates understood what humanity had already known for decades. Weakness was an invitation. If the galaxy did not prepare, the next strike would not be a test. It would be the end. The Senate reconvened, their chamber still trembling from the aftershocks of the battle. This time, the voices that rose were no longer laced with scorn toward humanity. They were laced with caution, respect, and in some cases, fear. The Kraith envoy admitted that without the human warship, the capital would have fallen. The Zeeth, though bitter, acknowledged that their fleets had been too far to respond in time, and it was the humans who had filled the gap. The Velari, who spoke rarely, gave their quiet assent, saying the warship had shifted the course of galactic history in a single night. For the first time since joining the Senate, humanity stood not as a junior member, but as an equal. Perhaps even something more. On Earth and the colonies, word of the battle spread like fire. What had begun as whispers of pride grew into a roar of unity. For generations, humans had seen themselves as outsiders, tolerated but never respected. Now their children looked to the stars, knowing that their people had stood when no one else could. Fear still lingered, fear of retaliation, fear of the greater storm promised in that chilling message, but it was tempered by something stronger: hope. Humanity had not been erased. Humanity had not been dismissed. They had been tested, and they had endured. On the warship, the crew worked tirelessly to stabilize systems. Engineers patched hull breaches, medics tended to the wounded, and officers recalibrated weapons that had pushed themselves to the breaking point. Despite the exhaustion etched into their faces, there was pride in their voices. They had seen the impossible, and they had overcome it. For many, it was the first real proof that the ship they had built in silence, in hidden shipyards, was more than just a desperate gamble. It was a guardian. It was a promise. The captain stood on the bridge, gazing out at the stars now littered with wreckage. He knew better than anyone that this battle was not the end, only the beginning. The enemy would return, stronger and more determined. Humanity's secret was gone forever. But as he looked at his crew, he also knew they would be ready. The warship had not been built to conquer. It had been built to survive. And survival was something humanity understood better than anyone. In the chamber, a final vote was cast. Humanity would retain full control of their warship. No inspections, no dismantling, no surrender of technology. The Senate could no longer afford to strip away the one force that had saved them. Instead, humanity was invited to lead a joint defense council charged with preparing the galaxy for the threat that lay beyond the stars. It was a role no one had imagined for Earth only weeks before, but now it was undeniable. Humanity had earned its place not by diplomacy alone, but by action. The ambassador listened as the vote was confirmed, his chest tight with emotion. For so long, his people had been mocked, underestimated, treated as little more than colonists stumbling through space. Now they had been given trust, and with it, responsibility. He thought of the workers who had built the warship in silence, of the families who had sacrificed so their children might live under its protection, and of the crew who had risked their lives in the fire above the capital. They had carried the burden so that he could stand here today, and he swore silently that their sacrifice would not be forgotten. And yet, even in triumph, the message lingered. The fire will spread. No one could dismiss those words. The enemy was watching, studying, waiting. They had seen humanity's strength, and they would not stop. The galaxy had been warned, and humanity had been marked. The storm was coming, and the next battle would test not just one warship, but the resolve of every world in the Senate. The ambassador ended his speech with simple words that carried farther than any grand declaration. He said humanity had built their ship not for glory, but for survival. And now survival was no longer just their cause. It was the cause of the entire galaxy. If they stood together, they had a chance. If they fractured, if they let suspicion divide them, then none of them would endure what was coming. His words struck deep because every delegate in the chamber had seen the truth with their own eyes. Alone, they were vulnerable. Together, they had hope. As the chamber adjourned, the ambassador walked in silence, his heart heavy but resolute. The path ahead was uncertain, but humanity had stepped into the light and could no longer turn back. Their hidden warship had become a beacon, and with that beacon came a responsibility to lead. In orbit, the warship continued its slow patrol, its engines glowing faintly as repair crews worked to restore its strength, its shadow still stretched across the Senate's world, no longer as a threat, but as a reminder. A reminder that humanity had been underestimated, that survival demanded strength, and that the galaxy itself had entered a new age. The delegates returned to their worlds, with images burned into their minds, the sight of a single human ship holding the line when all others had faltered. They carried those memories back to their people, and slowly a new understanding began to take root. Humanity was not the weakest among them anymore. Humanity had become the unexpected protector, the one force willing to stand in the darkest moment. The war had not yet arrived, but its shadow had already touched them all. And as the galaxy prepared, one truth echoed across every world, spoken in awe, in fear, in hope. Humanity had revealed its hidden strength, and nothing would ever be the same again. For the humans aboard the warship, for the colonies scattered across the stars, and for the ambassador who had stood against the storm, the lesson was clear. They had not chosen this role, but they had accepted it. Humanity's survival was now bound to the survival of the galaxy itself. The stars outside, the viewport glimmered with cold light, but for the first time, the crew felt something more than dread. They felt purpose. The warship was no longer hidden. It was a promise to all who watched that humanity would endure, and in enduring, they would give others the chance to endure as well. The galaxy was preparing for the fire to spread. But this time, it would not face it alone. And with that truth, the warship carried humanity forward into a future that would test them all, but a future they were finally ready to meet.